My father introduced me, and now it's my son's turn. Woodworking is a passion we'll share forever. Woodcraft understands that. Their people know the right tool for the job, and they make sure we understand how to use it. Their help? It means a lot. Woodcraft knows how we feel because they feel the same way. You know, I enjoy sharing my secrets, and now Jake's teaching me some things too. Woodcraft, helping you make wood work.
Tight Bond Wood Glues, the pro's advantage.
Hello and welcome to another episode of I Can Do That. I'm your host, Chad Stanton, and today's project is this table. Well, not exactly this table, but how to join the legs to this table. We're going to show you 6 different methods on how to join the legs. Let's take a look here a second. You can see that we have a brace holding this one together. We also are going to use pocket screws. There's also the method of some through screws on it, and there's some joints that you can't see, such as dowels, a floating tenon, and a mortise and tenon. We're not only going to show you how to make these, but we're going to tell you why and when to use each of them. And then you can choose the comfort level based on your tools and skill. All right, so let's set this aside and we'll start showing you our first joint. Okay, so let's start with the hardest first and get that out of the way, and that is the mortise and tenon. Now, I have to say that there are 100 different ways to do mortise and tenons. There's books devoted to this. So I'm going to try and break it down to do the easiest for the tools that we have. So let's take a look here. We have the mortise and then the tenon, and a couple of guidelines to go by. The tenon, the thickness, should be 1/3 the thickness of the stock. In this case, I have 3/4 inch, and so this is only 1/4 inch wide. The width of the tenon should be 2/3 of what our stock is. Again, at 3.5, this is 2 3/8 long. And then for the length of the tenon, well, it should be 5 times the thickness. So at 1/4 inch, this would be 1 1/4 inches long. Now, I'm not going that long. The theory is anything past 5 times the length, it doesn't create any more strength. So in this case, 1 inch is going to be fine for me. Now, the other rule that I go by is I always make the mortise first. The reason is after I make the mortise, well, I'm probably going to have to clean up the insides of those walls, and thereby it becomes wider. If I made the tenon first and then cleaned up the mortise, it would probably be a loose, sloppy fit. That way I can measure what the mortise is and make the tenon fit snug. Okay, now let me set up the tools that we're going to use. I'm going to use a doweling jig and our router table. I'll bring that in and show you the method. Okay, to begin with our mortise and tenon, we're actually going to start with the mortise. And I'm going to be using my doweling jig with that. I also have a 1/4 inch brad point bit here, which matches our 1/4 inch thick tenon. I also have some tape wrapped around that. That's because I want the mortise to be 1 inch deep. So the tape is going to tell me where to stop drilling. I also took some time to do some layout marks on it, and you can see this is what's going to be the mortise to fit the size of our tenon. All right, so let me begin with this. Okay, and the doweling jig automatically finds the center of the workpiece. And I have a series of holes on top here for different size holes I want to drill. In this case, again, I have to line it up with 1/4 inch. So I'm going to drill the start and the end to begin with. And now I'm going to slowly move the doweling jig over and drill a series of holes. Okay, now that I drilled all those holes, well, I really need to square this up. So I'm going to use a chisel and slowly work my way down this. And this is where I said that the mortise can actually sometimes get a little bit wider than our 1/4 inch. Just grab these ends. I want to be careful not to pry back on this because I can bruise that wood. Now it's probably not going to be seen, but it's just a good habit to get into. All right, I've got a little bit more cleaning up to do on this, but once I get this done, then I'm going to show you how we're going to make that tenon on the router table. Okay, so I'm getting set up to make the tenon. Now, what I did was I first measured for my 3 equal parts, and you can see I'm going to remove on both sides of it, leaving me with a 1/4 inch thick there. I also measured down 1 inch. That's going to be the depth of the tenon. So over on the router table, I have a little setup to do. I want to make sure that I get the edge of the router bit 1 inch to the fence. When I clamp the fence down, I want to make sure that the fence is square to the table. The reason being is I have to slide my miter gauge through here. And if the fence isn't parallel with this, it's going to pinch and bind. I also have screwed on a sacrificial board to the miter gauge so that when the router bit comes through, it's going to want to like explode and shatter some of the wood fibers on the end, and this piece will help prevent that. Lastly, I made sure that my miter gauge now has this little guide on it, which is going to prevent it from racking on me. Okay. Oh, the most important thing is I had to set the depth of the router bit. Now I'm going to try and come up just shy of my line because I want to sneak up on it and test the fit. So let me get my first pass, and I'm not going to try and make this all in one big pass. I'm going to do multiple pieces, and once my workpiece hits the fence, I know I'm at the bottom depth there. Okay, so you can see I have some more adjusting to do. First of all, I didn't get to the depth I wanted on it. I missed the line. And same with the thickness. I'm off. There's no way this tenon is going to fit in that mortise. But that's okay. It's better that it's a little fat than too thin. All right, so let me keep adjusting it, sneaking up on it, and I'll show you the next step. So after making several passes and a few adjustments, I've come up with a fit that I like. But take a look at this. See this line going across my tenon? Well, what I did was I made the pass just on that edge there and checked it, and it was a little too loose. So I readjusted it to make it a little bit thicker. Now, once I got the thickness that I liked, just to make sure that it's even all the way across, I run it a few more times over the router bit just to make sure that it's totally flat. Now, as far as the fit for the piece, as it goes into the mortise, it should be snug, but I shouldn't have to use a mallet to put it together. And if I don't have a little bit of resistance, well, it's probably too loose. So what I have to do now is I need to cut it to the size of the mortise. So I'm just simply laying the piece on top, keeping this flush, and my pencil lines I'm going to transfer onto here. Okay, now I need to cut that off, and I'm just going to use a handsaw for that. Now if you can see, when I cut this, it's still raised up a little bit. I have a little bit of a hump. So just with the chisel, I'm going to try and flatten that out. To the other side. And we'll test the fit. Well, I'm a little long still. So I'm going to trim that up with a chisel, maybe have to play with it with a file, and we'll come back and see how it fits. All right, let's see how we do this time. Oh, that's a nice fit. No gaps, flush all the way around. That's a real good job on that mortise and tenon. So what's the advantages and the cons of using this? Well, the advantage is with that tenon into the mortise, I'm using all the grain and the strength of the board going into it. Plus, I get a lot of glue surface on both ends of these. So I have face grain grabbing it, gluing it, making it really strong. This is why this joint has lasted for hundreds of years and it's still used today. Now, the disadvantage to making this, well, if you don't have the mortise straight or the tenon straight, your apron's going to be off on an angle and that's going to throw the rest of the project all out of whack. Also, too, you notice that I had to use the router table on this. So again, if you don't have a router table, this particular method isn't going to work for you. So let's look at our next joint, which is the floating mortise and tenon. And we'll set that up and show you that next. Okay, so the floating tenon, the procedure is similar to making the mortise and tenon. Just like before, I'm going to make the mortise on the leg using my doweling jig. I'm also going to use the same doweling jig up here on the end grain of the apron. So what I have to do after that is I need to make the actual tenon. In this case, I'm using some 1/4 inch solid wood. Now, I'm using the solid wood because if I go to the store and get some 1/4 inch plywood, it's not always 1/4 inch. It could be millimeter or even 3/16. And again, the fit on this is just as important. I want to have some resistance to it. And that would be how we make our floating mortise and tenon. Now, the advantages of this, well, it's faster than cutting out the tenons. I can just get a 1/4 inch piece of wood and cut as many tenons as I want. Also, too, there's speed in the fact that I'm using just this one tool to make 2 mortises versus using the router table as well. The disadvantages, well, I don't have that grain going all the way through the apron and into the tenon. I have an individual piece now in there, and that can also lead to possibility it being loose and just another place for a possible failure because of the fit. Now, the next joint we're going to do is we're going to use dowel pins, and much like the floating tenon, the dowel is a smaller version of that, and so we're going to show you 2 methods on how you can make your dowels. Okay, so doing the dowels is pretty easy. I'm going to take my apron and lay it on the leg, and I'm going to make a couple of marks on the face of the leg and on the apron. And the position of these, it doesn't really matter. In this case, I'm just going to put 2 dowel pins in both of these. Now I'm going to place the apron in the vise, and again I'm going to use the doweling jig. And as I mentioned before, there's different size holes that I can use on this. In this case, I'm using 3/8 for my dowel pins. So I'm going to line up my marks. And I have a drill bit with a stop collar on it. And this is going to give me the depth that I need for those pins. Okay, now I'm going to widen out the doweling jig to put it on the leg. And same thing. I'll line up my pencil marks with the mark on the jig, and once again drill. And if I had my pencil marks correctly, with some glue and clamps, when this is done, it's going to hold together. Now this jig, it's not terribly expensive, but if you think you're not going to do this a whole lot, there is another way to do it. And that's with these doweling pins. Essentially, the way they work is, you would drill the holes in one of the pieces, and then I'm going to place them in the holes. And then as I position it where I want, I press down, and it makes 2 indentations on where I need to drill. And then I could go about and do the same procedure. Now, the advantages of this, well, it's fast, and it gives you like a mini tenon, just like we had before, providing you with some strength. The disadvantages, well, because that's round and it's wood, it is going to change in shape, and that will eventually loosen up. It's not the strongest joint out there, but it's fast and it does work. Okay, now let's do another method, one that we've used plenty of times, and that's the pocket screws. Okay, so pocket screws is something we've used a lot on the show, and if you've never seen it before, well, let me walk you through it real quick. With the pocket screws, we have this special drill bit, which is going to do a pre-drill and countersink a hole all at the same time. It also has an adjustable collar on it to adjust for the different depths and thicknesses of wood. The screws we're using are specifically for pocket screws, and what that is they're a self-tapping screw at one end, and then you'll notice that the head is flat, unlike a regular drywall screw where it's chamfered. The flat is going to make sure it's holding nice and solid, where that chamfer could sink into the wood, not giving us a good enough grip. The jig will allow us to clamp our workpiece in here. The jig itself is also adjustable for the thickness of the material. Okay, and then I'm going to place my apron on the leg, and I measured and traced around with a pencil where I want my piece to live. And I'll put a couple of screws in. And screw it down. Okay, so the advantage of this, very fast, and it is a strong joint. However, the disadvantage is that I'm going to have these holes. Now, that's not a bad thing if it's going to be hidden, like on the inside of the workpiece, but you certainly wouldn't want to see this on the outside. The other thing, too, is because these holes are on an angle, well, when I tighten this up, you'll notice that I'm slightly off my line. Now, that's not that big of a deal here, but sometimes it can make all the difference. So you have to factor in on that shifting. To help prevent that movement, you might want to brace it or clamp it in some way so it doesn't move on you. The other thing to think about too is that we have metal going through wood, and this wood is going to change through the seasons, and those screws might actually become loose at some point. Versus that mortise and tenon that's all wood and glued together, I guarantee it's not going anywhere. And as far as putting glue on this, will that give it some strength? Sure, but I got end grain on this piece, and end grain is not a good way to make a strong joint. All right, let's move on to another joint using screws, but we're not going to need these jigs to do it. Okay, so this method is the through screw. The screw is actually going through the leg and into the apron. Now, to do this, we don't need any jigs, but we are going to need 3 different drill bits for it. The first drill bit is going to be drilling our countersink hole. That's going to make sure that the head of the screw sits below the surface of the leg. The next drill bit we're going to need is one that is a clearance hole. A clearance hole essentially is slightly larger than the threads of the screw, because we want the screw, again, to go through the leg. After I have the countersink and the clearance hole, I'm going to use an awl, and I'm going to hold my apron and make a mark onto the apron. From there, I need to make a pilot hole. A pilot hole is a drill bit that is slightly smaller than the threads of the screw. That's because if we run the screw in, we have a chance of splitting out the wood. Okay, now to hide these holes, I'm going to use a 3/8 dowel rod that I will put in there with some glue and then cut it off flush. So, the advantages of this joint. Well, you certainly don't need any jigs, and it's reasonably fast. The disadvantages, well, that screw is going all into end grain, so it's not as strong as our pocket screws. Also, too, I have to deal with these unsightly holes. Now, when you put the plug in it, it doesn't look bad, and some factors on the piece you're making can actually be decorative. However, though, on some applications, you don't want to see that, so it becomes distracting. The last method we're going to show you is you're not going to need any jigs, and we're not going to leave any visible marks from the outside. So let's show that one next. So the last method we're going to do is building a bracket for it. Now, this bracket is a mitered 45 piece, and this is actually holding the two aprons. And then this little spacer block and a couple more screws, that's holding the leg. Let me take it apart and show it to you. Okay, the method for this, it's pretty simple. You're cutting your piece at 45 degrees on the miter saw. However, you have to be careful. You can't go too small with making that piece because it's really dangerous to cut at that. So this spacer block is needed to bridge the gap in between it. And then, of course, I can't just take my leg and clamp it and screw it to it. I have to chamfer that corner off the leg. And then I can essentially do some clearance hole, a pilot hole, and screw it together. Now, this method I honestly really wouldn't recommend. It's awkward getting the measurements and the size. You have a good chance for gaps to develop. I just don't think it's the best method for putting your table together. In fact, you can go down to Woodcraft and buy a metal bracket that does exactly this, and it's a lot easier. But if you're working on a budget, some scrap wood can do the job. So there you are, 6 different methods for attaching the table legs to the table. Whether you want to go with a tried and true method that's lasted over 100 years, or the speed and ease of today's technology, you pick the method that's best for you and what's best for the project. Now on our next project, I'm actually going to be building a table using one of these methods, but with a slight twist. So stay tuned for that, and we'll see you right here next time on I Can Do That.